June 1940. The North Atlantic wind cut through the uniforms of the captured German sailors as they stood on the deck of a British destroyer, eyes fixed on the distant Canadian coastline. For days, rumors had swirled among the prisoners, whispers of what awaited them in this mysterious land across the ocean. Back in Germany, every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every propaganda poster had painted Canada as a frozen wasteland, a forgotten outpost of the British Empire. The message was always the same. Canada was nothing but endless forests, scattered log cabins, and a handful of struggling farmers. No real cities, no industry, no power. Just snow, trees, and silence. The sailors believed it. Why wouldn't they? Their officers spoke with certainty, their teachers repeated the same stories, and the Nazi press never missed a chance to mock Canada as a primitive colony. Some even joked that Canadians still traveled by horse and sleigh, that electricity was a luxury, and that the only thing colder than the weather was the welcome they'd receive. As the destroyer pushed closer to shore, the men huddled together, shivering not just from the cold but from the uncertainty. What kind of place would hold them now? Would they be forced to chop wood in endless forests, or toil on remote farms, cut off from the world they knew? Klaus, a young sailor from Hamburg, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe we'll teach them how to build a real factory," he said, forcing a laugh. Werner, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. "They'll see what German engineering looks like," he added, his voice tinged with pride. Even in defeat, the men clung to the idea of German superiority. They imagined themselves as the last torchbearers of civilization, about to be dropped into a land untouched by progress. But beneath the bravado, anxiety simmered. The unknown stretched before them, as wide and cold as the Atlantic itself. Some wondered if they'd ever see their families again. Others worried about the stories they'd heard, of endless winters, of isolation, of years spent in a land that time forgot. The coastline grew larger, the details sharpening with every passing minute. Trees gave way to buildings, and the outline of a harbor began to emerge from the morning mist. The conversations faded. The laughter died. Every man on deck felt the weight of the moment. They were prisoners now, stripped of their weapons, their uniforms still damp from the sinking of their U-boat. The only thing they carried was the image of Canada that had been drilled into their minds, a place of hardship, backwardness, and struggle. They braced themselves for the worst, convinced that nothing on this side of the Atlantic could ever compare to the power and sophistication of Germany. But as the destroyer turned the final corner into Halifax Harbor, every expectation shattered in an instant. The silence on deck was total. The German sailors stared, mouths open, as a new reality unfolded before their eyes, a reality that would haunt them for years to come. The destroyer glided into Halifax Harbor, and the German prisoners felt their world tilt. This was not the Canada they'd been warned about. Instead of a sleepy colonial outpost, they saw a city alive with energy and industry, something that looked more like New York or Boston than the wilderness they'd imagined. Towering cranes, taller than any building in their hometowns, reached into the sky like steel giants. The docks were packed with cargo ships, their hulls painted with names that hinted at global trade and power. The air buzzed with the sound of engines, the clang of metal, and the shouts of workers moving with purpose. Electric lights glowed from every warehouse, even though the sun was still high. Paved roads crisscrossed the harbor, lined with trucks and rail cars loaded with supplies. The scale was overwhelming. Klaus gripped the railing, counting cranes, 23 just in his line of sight. He counted ships, more than 300, each one larger than anything he'd seen in Germany's so-called primitive colonies. The shipyard stretched for miles, with new vessels under construction, their skeletons rising from the ground like monuments to a future the prisoners had never imagined. Werner stood beside him, shaking his head in disbelief. This wasn't the backward Canada they'd been told about. This was a city that pulsed with industrial might, a place where progress was measured in steel and concrete, not in fairy tales and propaganda. The harbor was a living machine, every part moving in perfect coordination. Workers in clean uniforms moved crates with practiced efficiency, their boots echoing on the concrete. Trucks rumbled past, engines roaring, tires spinning on smooth asphalt. Electric streetcars glided along metal tracks, weaving through the city with a quiet confidence. The German sailors watched in stunned silence as the destroyer docked. The British guards barked orders, but the prisoners barely heard them. Their eyes were locked on the scene unfolding around them. They saw warehouses bigger than entire German villages, factories belching smoke into the sky, and office buildings made of brick and glass. They saw a city that looked more modern than Hamburg, more organized than Bremen. Every detail contradicted everything they'd been told. As they marched down the gangplank, the prisoners passed Canadian workers who barely glanced at them. There was no mockery, no gloating, just the steady rhythm of a city that had no time for old grudges. The prisoners were herded toward a waiting train, but their minds were still back at the harbor, replaying every detail. Klaus tried to make sense of it all. If Halifax looked like this, what did Toronto or Montreal look like? How many factories did Canada really have? How much could they produce? The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last. The train station was the final blow. It stretched for half a mile, paved with concrete, lit by electric lamps hanging from metal poles. Signs pointed to destinations across the country, printed in crisp, clean letters. The train itself was a marvel, 20 passenger cars behind a gleaming locomotive, steam rising in white clouds. The platform was spotless, the buildings freshly painted, the whole scene more efficient and modern than anything the prisoners had seen in wartime Germany. As the train pulled away from Halifax, the German sailors sat in silence, staring out the windows at a country that defied every expectation. They realized with a sinking feeling that they had been lied to. Canada was not a land of snow and shadows. It was a nation of power, progress, and possibility, a place that could outbuild, outwork, and outlast anything they had ever known. And as the city faded into the distance, one thought echoed in every mind. If Canada could do this, what could America do? The train rumbled out of Halifax, carrying its cargo of stunned German prisoners deeper into the Canadian heartland. As the steel wheels clattered over the tracks, the men pressed their faces to the windows, hungry for answers. What they saw outside shattered every last piece of Nazi propaganda they'd ever believed. Instead of endless forests and empty fields, the landscape unfolded like a living testament to modern power. Towns dotted the horizon, each one connected by smooth, paved roads and electric lines that stretched as far as the eye could see. The prisoners watched cars and trucks zip along highways, their engines humming with the promise of progress. Every mile brought new surprises. They passed through bustling towns where brick buildings stood 4 and 5 stories tall, their windows gleaming in the sunlight. Storefronts displayed goods that had vanished from German shelves years ago: shoes, radios, fresh fruit, and even chocolate bars. Electric streetcars glided through intersections, their bells ringing as they carried workers to factories and children to school. The prisoners saw people dressed in clean, sturdy clothes, their faces healthy and untroubled by the hunger and fear that haunted Europe. The train itself was a marvel. Each car was fitted with padded seats, electric lights, and heating vents that kept the chill at bay. The air smelled faintly of coal and machine oil, a scent that spoke of industry and comfort. Klaus ran his hand over the seat cushion, marveling at its softness. Werner stared out the window, his mind racing. In Germany, even civilians went without basic comforts. Here, even prisoners traveled in warmth and safety. As the train sped west, the scenery shifted from city to countryside. But even the rural stretches defied expectations. Farms spread out in neat, orderly rows, their barns painted bright red, their fields dotted with modern tractors and gleaming silos. Cows grazed in fenced pastures, and every farmhouse had electric lights glowing in the dusk. The prisoners saw no sign of the poverty or backwardness they'd been promised. Instead, they saw a land of abundance, where technology and hard work had transformed the wilderness into a patchwork of prosperity. At every stop, the scale of Canadian infrastructure became more obvious. Train stations were clean and efficient, with platforms paved in concrete and signs pointing to distant cities: Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg. Freight trains thundered past, loaded with lumber, grain, and manufactured goods. The prisoners watched workers load and unload cargo with practiced speed, their movements as precise as any assembly line in Germany. The further they traveled, the more the prisoners realized how much they'd been deceived. Canada was not a forgotten colony. It was a nation on the move, powered by industry and innovation. The Germans sat in silence, each man lost in thought. If this was just one part of North America, what kind of power did the United States possess? The question lingered in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. As night fell, the train's lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the faces of the prisoners. They watched the countryside roll by, mile after mile of proof that the world was bigger and stronger than they'd ever imagined. The propaganda had lied. The truth was rolling past their windows, undeniable and unstoppable. And as the train thundered toward its destination, the German sailors understood that their war had already changed forever. When the train finally slowed to a stop, the German prisoners braced themselves for the worst. They expected to be herded into wooden barracks, forced to sleep on straw, and survive on scraps. But as the bus rolled through the gates of Camp 30, reality once again defied every expectation. The compound looked nothing like the prison camps they'd heard about in whispered rumors or seen in old newsreels. Instead, it resembled a small American college campus: solid concrete buildings with brick foundations, real windows, and metal roofs that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The grounds were neat and orderly, with paved walkways and trimmed grass, not the muddy chaos they'd imagined. Inside the barracks, the surprises kept coming. Each room held 30 metal beds, arranged in perfect rows. Every bed had a real mattress, 2 thick wool blankets, and a pillow with a crisp white case. The floors were smooth concrete, swept clean and free of dust. Electric lights hung from the ceiling, casting a steady glow, and heating vents along the walls pushed out warm air that chased away the Canadian chill. Klaus sat on his assigned bed and pressed down on the mattress, half expecting it to vanish. It gave way under his hand, soft and comfortable, better than what most German civilians had at home. The first meal at Camp 30 was a revelation. The prisoners lined up in a spacious dining hall, expecting watery soup and stale bread. Instead, the kitchen staff served thick slices of roast beef, mountains of mashed potatoes with real butter, cooked carrots and green beans, fresh bread, milk, and even apples. Klaus stared at his tray, unable to believe his eyes. In Germany, his family survived on ration cards and hope. Here, in a prison camp, he was eating like a king. Around the room, the other prisoners ate in silence, the only sound the clink of forks on metal trays. No one spoke. No one dared to break the spell. The shock of abundance was almost painful. Letters from home told stories of hunger and hardship, families waiting in line for hours to buy a loaf of bread, children who hadn't tasted meat in months, mothers who watered down soup to make it last. Yet here, the enemy was fed better than the people they'd left behind. The irony was sharp and bitter. Some men felt shame, others felt anger, but all of them felt the truth. The world was not as they'd been told. Life at Camp 30 settled into a routine that felt more like waiting than punishment. The guards were strict but not cruel. There were rules, but there was also dignity. The prisoners could write letters, receive Red Cross parcels, and even play soccer on the camp's field. The barracks were warm in winter and cool in summer. The food never ran out. Every day, the men woke up to a reality that challenged everything they'd believed about the outside world. The psychological impact was profound. For years, they'd been told that Germany was the pinnacle of civilization, that other nations were weak and backward. But here, in captivity, they saw a different kind of strength, a strength built on industry, organization, and a quiet confidence that didn't need to shout. The realization was slow, but it was unstoppable. If Canada could treat its enemies with this much humanity, what did that say about the values they'd been fighting for? As the days turned into weeks, the German prisoners began to understand that their defeat was not just on the battlefield. It was in every meal, every warm bed, every act of unexpected kindness. The war had already been lost, not by force, but by the sheer weight of a society that worked. And as they lay in their bunks at night, listening to the hum of electric heaters, they wondered what other truths had been hidden from them, and what else they might discover in this land of quiet power. The bus carrying the German prisoners rolled to a stop in front of Camp 30, and the men braced themselves for the worst. They expected to see a bleak makeshift prison, wooden shacks, barbed wire, and guards with cold eyes. Instead, what greeted them looked more like a small American college campus than a prison camp. The buildings were solid, made of concrete and brick, with real glass windows and sturdy metal roofs. The grounds were clean and orderly, with paved walkways and trimmed lawns. Even the guard towers, standing tall at each corner of the fence, were equipped with electric lights and heating systems. It was a far cry from the primitive outpost they'd been warned about. Inside the barracks, the surprises kept coming. Each room was lined with neat rows of metal beds, every one topped with a real mattress, two thick wool blankets, and a pillow with a crisp white case. The floors were smooth concrete, swept spotless. Electric lights hung from the ceiling, casting a steady glow, and heating vents along the walls pushed out warm air that chased away the Canadian chill. Klaus sat on his assigned bed and pressed down on the mattress, half expecting it to vanish. It gave way under his hand, soft and comfortable, better than what most German civilians had at home. The first meal at Camp 30 was a revelation. The prisoners lined up in a spacious dining hall, expecting watery soup and stale bread. Instead, the kitchen staff served thick slices of roast beef, mountains of mashed potatoes with real butter, cooked carrots and green beans, fresh bread, milk, and even apples. Klaus stared at his tray, unable to believe his eyes. In Germany, his family survived on ration cards and hope. Here, in a prison camp, he was eating like a king. Around the room, the other prisoners ate in silence, the only sound the clink of forks on metal trays. No one spoke. No one dared to break the spell. The shock of abundance was almost painful. Letters from home told stories of hunger and hardship, families waiting in line for hours to buy a loaf of bread, children who hadn't tasted meat in months, mothers who watered down soup to make it last. Yet here, the enemy was fed better than the people they'd left behind. The irony was sharp and bitter. Some men felt shame, others felt anger, but all of them felt the truth. The world was not as they'd been told. Life at Camp 30 settled into a routine that felt more like waiting than punishment. The guards were strict but not cruel. There were rules, but there was also dignity. The prisoners could write letters, receive Red Cross parcels, and even play soccer on the camp's field. The barracks were warm in winter and cool in summer. The food never ran out. Every day, the men woke up to a reality that challenged everything they'd believed about the outside world. The psychological impact was profound. For years, they'd been told that Germany was the pinnacle of civilization, that other nations were weak and backward. But here, in captivity, they saw a different kind of strength. A strength built on industry, organization, and a quiet confidence that didn't need to shout. The realization was slow, but it was unstoppable. If Canada could treat its enemies with this much humanity, what did that say about the values they'd been fighting for? As the days turned into weeks, the German prisoners began to understand that their defeat was not just on the battlefield. It was in every meal, every warm bed, every act of unexpected kindness. The war had already been lost, not by force but by the sheer weight of a society that worked. And as they lay in their bunks at night, listening to the hum of electric heaters, they wondered what other truths had been hidden from them, and what else they might discover in this land of quiet power. A week after settling into Camp 30, the German prisoners received news that would change their understanding of the war forever. The camp commander announced that a select group would be allowed to visit local factories, not as forced labor, but as observers. The Geneva Convention protected them from working on war materials, but Canada wanted these men to see something with their own eyes. For the prisoners, It sounded like a strange privilege. For the Allies, it was a calculated move, a chance to show the enemy just how much power North America could bring to bear. The bus ride to Toronto was a revelation in itself. The prisoners passed through neighborhoods lined with two-story houses, each with a manicured lawn and a car parked in the driveway. Shopping districts bustled with activity, store windows filled with goods that had become distant memories in Germany: clothing, tools, radios, and fresh produce. Klaus counted 3 department stores on a single block, each one stocked with merchandise. In Germany, shelves sat empty unless you had a ration card and luck on your side. But the real shock came when the bus pulled up to the gates of Victory Aircraft. The factory complex stretched for half a mile in every direction, a sprawling testament to industrial might. Signs outside announced that 4,000 workers clocked in every day. Inside, the noise was deafening, an organized thunder of machinery, voices, and the steady hum of progress. The prisoners watched as men and women worked side by side on assembly lines, each person focused on a specific task. Fuselage sections moved overhead on cranes, wings were attached with precision tools, and engines hung from metal frames, waiting for installation. A supervisor, speaking through a translator, explained that this single factory produced 50 Lancaster bombers every month. 50. Klaus did the math in his head, 600 planes a year from just one facility. He knew that Germany, stretched thin by Allied bombing and resource shortages, could only dream of such numbers. If Canada had even a handful of factories like this, the outcome of the war was already written. And Canada was just one part of the Allied machine. The United States, with its vast resources and limitless manpower, was building even more tanks, planes, ships, on a scale that defied belief. The tour continued at Canadian Car and Foundry, where Hurricane fighter planes rolled off the assembly line every few hours. The supervisor mentioned contracts for over 1,000 planes, and the workers moved with calm efficiency, as if building war machines was just another day's work. No panic, no chaos, just relentless, organized production. On the way back to camp, the bus passed an aluminum plant, its smokestacks pouring into the sky. A sign by the road boasted that the plant processed 250,000 tons of aluminum every year, more than some countries produced in a decade. The message was clear: North America's industrial power was unstoppable. The prisoners sat in stunned silence, each man grappling with the scale of what he'd seen. The numbers didn't lie. The Allies could outbuild, outproduce, and outlast anything Germany could throw at them. The war, they realized, wasn't just being fought on the front lines. It was being won in the factories, on the assembly lines, and in the relentless drive of a society that believed in progress. As the bus rolled back into Camp 30, Klaus stared out the window, his mind racing. If Canada could do this, what was happening in Detroit, in Chicago, and Los Angeles? The United States was a giant, and now he understood just how powerful that giant had become. The war was no longer a contest of armies. It was a contest of nations, and the side with the most factories, the most workers, and the most determination would win. For the first time, Klaus felt the weight of inevitability. The Allies weren't just fighting for victory. They were building it, one plane, one tank, one ship at a time. Back at Camp 30, the German prisoners tried to process what they had witnessed in the Canadian factories. But the surprises didn't stop at the assembly lines. Every day in captivity revealed another layer of North American strength, not just in steel and machines, but in the way people treated each other, even their enemies. For men raised on stories of Allied cruelty and chaos, the reality was almost impossible to accept. The daily routine at Camp 30 was nothing like the grim existence they'd imagined. Each morning, the prisoners woke to the steady hum of electric heaters and the soft glow of overhead lights. Breakfast was served hot and plentiful: eggs, bread, butter, and sometimes even bacon. The guards, mostly Canadians but sometimes Americans on exchange, enforced the rules but never with malice. There were no beatings, no starvation rations, no threats. Instead, there was a quiet expectation of order and respect. The prisoners were allowed to write letters home, receive Red Cross parcels, and even organize soccer matches on the camp's well-kept field. But it was the small acts of kindness that left the deepest mark. On holidays, the dining hall was decorated with pine branches and ribbons. At Christmas, the kitchen staff prepared a feast that would have been the envy of any American family: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and even pumpkin pie. Each prisoner received a Red Cross parcel, packed with chocolate, cigarettes, and canned milk. For men whose families back in Germany survived on ration cards and hope, these moments felt surreal. Klaus remembered the first time he bit into a fresh orange, shipped all the way from California. He stared at the bright fruit in his hand, unable to believe it was real. The camp also offered opportunities for growth. Prisoners could take English classes taught by Canadian volunteers, read newspapers from Toronto and New York, and borrow books from a well-stocked library. Some even enrolled in correspondence courses from North American universities, learning accounting, engineering, or literature while sitting in their barracks. The irony was sharp. Here they were, learning from their captors, treated with more dignity than many free citizens in war-torn Europe. The psychological impact was profound. Letters from home painted a picture of despair: families waiting in line for hours for a loaf of bread, children who hadn't tasted meat in months, cities reduced to rubble by Allied bombers. Yet here, the enemy was fed, clothed, and educated. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Some prisoners felt guilt, others felt anger, but all of them felt the truth. The world was not as they'd been told. One afternoon, a Coca-Cola truck pulled up to the camp kitchen, delivering crates of glass bottles. The sight of the iconic American brand stunned the prisoners. In Germany, even coffee was a luxury, replaced by bitter substitutes made from acorns. Here, the enemy drank Coca-Cola with their meals. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes about the abundance and confidence of North American society. As the seasons changed, the routine at Camp 30 became almost comfortable. The guards treated the prisoners as men, not monsters. There was discipline, but also humanity. The prisoners began to talk among themselves, sharing their astonishment at the life they were living. They realized that real power wasn't just about tanks and planes. It was about the ability to feed, educate, and even forgive. The war, they understood, was being won not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of those who saw their enemies as people. For Klaus and his fellow prisoners, the lesson was clear. The strength of North America wasn't just in its factories or its armies. It was in the way it treated those who had nothing left. That quiet dignity, that relentless kindness, was a force no propaganda could erase, and it changed them forever. When the war finally ended, the news swept through Camp 30 like a cold wind. The German prisoners gathered in the common room, listening to radio broadcasts from London and New York. The voices spoke of surrender, of Hitler's death, of Berlin in ruins. For many, the words felt distant and unreal. But as the days passed and the reality of defeat settled in, the men began to prepare for the journey home, a journey that would reveal just how much the world had changed. Repatriation was slow and uncertain. The Allies processed millions of prisoners across Europe, and Camp 30 emptied group by group, month by month. Klaus left in March 1946, nearly 6 years after his capture. He boarded a British ship bound for Hamburg, his belongings packed into a small bag, English textbooks, a Red Cross journal, and a letter of recommendation from his Canadian teacher. As the ship crossed the Atlantic, Klaus thought about the train ride that had first brought him to Camp 30, the clean cities, the endless factories, the sense of order and abundance. He wondered what waited for him in Germany. The answer came as the ship entered Hamburg harbor. The city he remembered was gone. Not damaged, not wounded, gone. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, replaced by fields of broken brick and twisted steel. The cranes that once loaded cargo now lay toppled like fallen trees. Only a handful of ships sat in the harbor, most too damaged to sail. The devastation was total. the silence broken only by the distant sound of hammers and the cries of children playing in the rubble. Klaus walked through streets he barely recognized. The bakery where his mother once bought bread was a crater. The school he attended as a boy was a burned-out shell. The apartment building where his family lived still stood, but half of it had collapsed. Inside, his mother looked 20 years older than her age, her hair gray, her body thin from years of hunger. His sister's husband had died on the Eastern Front. His nephew, now 10, slept on a pile of blankets in the corner, his eyes wide with hunger and uncertainty. The contrast with Camp 30 was almost unbearable. In Canada, the prisoners had complained when the turkey was a little dry. Here, his family survived on 900 calories a day if the supply trucks arrived. There was no electricity, no running water, no heat. His mother cooked on a camping stove, burning scraps of wood scavenged from the ruins. Klaus opened his bag and pulled out a chocolate bar he'd saved from his last Red Cross parcel. His nephew stared at it, eyes wide. The boy had never seen chocolate before. Klaus broke it into 4 pieces and handed them out. His mother held her piece like it was gold. His sister cried. His nephew ate his slowly, savoring every bite. As night fell, Klaus told them about Canada. He described the heated barracks, the Christmas dinners, the factories that built 50 planes a month. His mother shook her head in disbelief. The radio had told them Germany was winning. The newspapers had promised victory. The government had said everything would be fine if they just held on a little longer. Klaus said nothing. What could he say? The truth was too heavy to speak. All across Germany, returning prisoners found the same devastation. Cities like Munich and Berlin were little more than skeletons of their former selves. Families were scattered, homes destroyed, hope in short supply. Some men, like Klaus's friend Werner, found their houses gone and their children barely remembered them. Others, like Captain Hartmann, used their English skills to find work with the Allied occupation forces, translating documents and helping rebuild what was left. But for all of them, the memory of Camp 30 lingered. They had seen a different kind of power, a power built not on fear or violence, but on abundance, dignity, and quiet confidence. They had learned that real strength was measured not by what you could destroy, but by what you could build and share. And as they walked through the ruins of their homeland, they carried that lesson with them, a reminder that the world was bigger, kinder, and more resilient than they had ever imagined. In the years after the war, the lessons learned at Camp 30 refused to fade. For thousands of former German prisoners, the memories of North American abundance and dignity haunted their return to a shattered homeland. Germany was rebuilding, but the scars of war ran deep. Cities still lay in ruins, food was scarce, and hope was a fragile thing. Yet, for men like Klaus, Werner, and Hartmann, the world had opened up in unexpected ways. They had seen a different kind of power, one that didn't rely on fear or force, but on opportunity, industry, and the quiet confidence of a society that believed in second chances. As the 1950s dawned, a surprising trend began to emerge. Former POWs started applying for immigration to Canada and the United States. The numbers grew each year, as word spread about the life they had glimpsed behind the fences of Camp 30. For many, it wasn't just about escaping the ruins of Germany. It was about chasing the promise of a better future, one they had seen with their own eyes. Klaus was among the first. Using his English skills and a letter of recommendation from his Canadian teacher, he secured a job at an aircraft factory in Toronto. The city was booming, its skyline rising higher each year, its streets alive with energy and optimism. Werner and Hartmann soon followed, drawn by stories of jobs, homes, and a life where hard work was rewarded. By 1960, thousands of former German POWs had made North America their new home. They became citizens, married, raised families, and contributed to the very industries they had once toured as prisoners. Some settled in the United States, drawn by the vast opportunities of cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles, places where factories never slept and the American dream felt within reach. Others stayed in Canada, building new lives in neighborhoods they had once glimpsed from the windows of a prison bus. The irony was not lost on them. They had come to North America as enemies, expecting punishment and hardship. Instead, they found a society that valued building over breaking, kindness over cruelty, and progress over propaganda. The lessons of Camp 30 shaped their lives and the lives of their children. They taught their families English, shared stories of Christmas dinners and Coca-Cola in captivity, and explained that real power was measured not by what you could conquer, but by what you could create. Klaus often thought about his nephew, now grown and working in a rebuilt German factory. He remembered his mother, who never truly recovered from the war, and the bittersweet taste of that first chocolate bar shared in a dark apartment. But in Toronto, surrounded by the hum of industry and the laughter of his own children, Klaus understood why he had chosen this new life. He wrote to a German newspaper, reflecting on the journey that had brought him from the ruins of Hamburg to the promise of North America. "We came as prisoners," he wrote, "but we stayed as men who understood why we lost. The war was not decided on the battlefield, but in the factories and homes of a nation that believed in dignity and hope." For thousands of former POWs, the choice was clear. They embraced the values they had learned in captivity, values of hard work, fairness, and respect. They became part of the American and Canadian story, living proof that even in the darkest times, the promise of a better life could shine through. And as they built new homes, new families, and new futures, they carried with them the quiet strength of a lesson learned behind barbed wire, that the true power of a nation is not in its weapons, but in its ability to build, to welcome, and to forgive.